All right. Okay, so thanks so much for being here, and sorry again for the delay. We're going to go ahead and get started. This session is a follow-up from the audit training and is really to focus on the specifics of the LEP, the Limited English Proficiency Sample Audit, and the process by which that will all happen, and the expectations and the timeline. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will stop periodically to address those questions. I'm here with my colleague, Lanisha Adams, and we are going to be doing this together, though I'm mostly going to be presenting, but feel free to pose any questions to either of us. So without further delay, the things we're going to be talking about today are the definition of LEP, the sample audit process, identifying LEP students in SLED, updating students' LEP statuses, acceptable documentation for the audit, and then the auditor document review process, and then we'll look at some non-examples from the audit. So first, the definition of LEP. Students must meet all 4 conditions of this federal definition in order to qualify for the LEP-NEP funding supplement through the UPSFF funding formula. So students, I won't read the entire definition for you, but students need to be between the ages of 3 and 21. They need to be enrolled in schools in DC, in a DC public or public charter school, and students need to have, 3 and 4, or C and D rather, are about the criteria through which, a student has difficulty reading, writing, speaking, and understanding English as measured by an OSSE-approved screener assessment. Just give everyone a chance to review this. I just realized my screen was frozen. Okay, moving on. Now we'll talk about the LEP sample audit process. So the way the sample audit process works is that a student universe, an LEP student universe, based on the students identified in SLED in the UPSFF Enrollment Audit roster on October 5th is what will be the basis of the LEP sample audit. Then after that point, OSSE removes students who automatically qualify as LEP or who are automatically disqualified. After that, OSSE sends the data to the auditor, and then the auditor will randomly sample the hire of 10% and 5 LEP students from the remaining roster. Only the students who couldn't be pre-approved or pre-denied, those are the only students who are in the universe of students eligible to be sampled, and then it's a random sample, is what this third step is saying, and the auditors, the independent auditor, would pull that random sample. After that, the auditor will request documentation for the students who were sampled. You shouldn't provide the documentation for all students, just provide the documentation for those that were sampled. The idea of this is to relieve the burden on LEAs for having to submit documentation for every single student. It should really just be a sample. And then the auditor will review the documentation and make determinations, approved, denied determinations based on the documentation submitted. After they review the documentation, if the auditor was not able to verify the LEP status of more than 2 students at a school, the auditor will request documentation for all students at the school who were eligible to be audited. This is a full school audit. If 2 or fewer students at the school couldn't be verified as LEP, then all students that were identified as LEP at the school, except those who couldn't be verified, will be approved. Any questions about the process? It looks like someone's having difficulty hearing me. Is anyone else having difficulty hearing me? Could you let me know? Okay. It seems like most people can hear me, so I'm going to continue on. And also to let you know, the webinar is being recorded, so I will post this online and make sure that you have access to it so that you can listen back if you're having difficulty hearing. So now we're going to talk about how to update students' LEP statuses. So the basis, the very first step of the audit process is it starts when the October 5th enrollment audit data freezes. And at that point, any student who's identified as LEP, that becomes the universe for the LEP audit. So leading up to that point, it's the LEA's responsibility to identify all LEP students as such in the student information system, so your PowerSchool or your eSchool Plus. And the way you do that is by marking yes in the LEP indicator data field in your SIS. So students who you should be identifying as LEP are those who had a qualifying access for ELL score from a past year, as well as those students who don't qualify or who don't have access testing history because they're outside of the age range or because they're new, but who were screened and identified as LEP by the LEA. So after you've identified and gone through the screening process, then you go to the student information system and make sure that all the students who should be identified as limited English proficient or English learners are. That is what SLED is reading. So every day, the LEP indicator data field from the LEA SIS will transfer to SLED through audit day, October 5th. Changes made by 5 p.m. will be accepted and reflected the next morning by 9 a.m. If you make a change in your SIS after 5 p.m. on the audit day, October 5th, the data will no longer be captured. So everything freezes after 5 p.m. on October 5th. So the point here is to start updating your LEP data in your SIS as early as possible and review it as frequently as possible. Any questions about how to update students' LEP statuses? Should students who waive services still be listed as LEP in our system? This is a great question. Thank you for asking that. Yes, even if a student's parents have chosen to not have that student receive services, the student is still considered LEP and should still be identified as LEP in your student information system. That student, if they're within the tested grades for access, is expected to test every year, even though they're not receiving services, until they exit LEP status. Any other questions? All right, I will keep moving in the interest of time. So to actually review the student's LEP statuses in SLED, the way you do that, and this should reflect what you sent over for your students' LEP statuses, is you navigate to SLED, You log in with your SLED credentials, and then you click on the Programs drop-down menu, and then the Enrollment Audit data menu is there, circled in red. To gain access to SLED, you should email sled.info@dc.gov. And just note that training is required before access will be granted, and so it's critical to get access now so you have time to actually review the data in SLED before the audit deadline and make sure that everything is accurate. And then once you're in SLED, to actually review students' information and what's actually being transferred over, in the SLED report, you can see at the LEA level and at the school level, there's a field called LEP, and this will show your LEA total by school of how many students are being identified as LEP. You can also export this report to Excel by clicking on the button there in the upper right corner. And you can also click on the link to see who the students are for the data fields. You can hide and sort different columns based on what you want to look at. And that's all for that. Now that same data is also available at the student level. So if you click on Programs, Enrollment Audit, and then the student level report, you'll be able to see the student level data that corresponds with the aggregates. So first you select the UPSFF population, and actually the report defaults to that, so you don't have to click on anything. You can also export this report to Excel. You can filter for enrollment status, and through the audit process, the auditors will find students to be not enrolled, and a student will not receive LEP funding if they're not considered to be enrolled. So you want to make sure that you're only looking at students who are found to be enrolled. Now, before I go any further, I actually wanted to stop and pause and show you in SLED what the data will look like, and also where you would go to see what your students' access testing history is. And I should have done this before, I'm sorry. But you log in with your SLED credentials. You click OK, and then you click on the Programs link, and then, like I was saying, the audit data can be found here. But to actually see what your student's testing history is, if you've enrolled a new student who wasn't at your school previously, you can see that data under Programs and then Next Generation Assessment Roster. And then you click on the Access for ELL's 2.0 report. And this report will show every student who is enrolled or tested at your LEA with the access testing history. So if you click on the export to Excel, well, in SLED you'll only see the most recent data, but you can export to Excel and see data from any year. So you can see here if you have a student enrolled who didn't actually test at your school, so no, they didn't test there, but they're currently there, and you can see what their testing history is on the access. So let's see, here's their composite score in column P. So this would be the place that you would go if you have a new student enrolled who you don't know what their testing history is before you administer an OSSE approved screener, how you would be able to tell if they were a LEP student or not and not have to test them. Any questions about where to go to identify students' testing history? Okay. So just going back to SLED, I just wanted to show you one more time. So if you are looking for the students currently identified as LEP according to the audit, you would go under programs, enrollment audit, and then you can see the student level or the LEA summary. If you want to go into SLED and find out what your students' testing history is, you would go into the Next Generation Assessments program page. Okay, moving back to the PowerPoint. All right, if you have any issues throughout the audit process, and especially leading up to October 5th, and you say, I have a student who is LEP, but they're not showing up as LEP in SLED, you would use the OSSE support tool, which is a quick-base application, and identify to submit a request for support. The OSSE support tool is available special education point of contact, the head of LEA, the enrollment audit POC, and the LEP POC. The way you do that is you log in and you click on Add Request for Support. This just shows you have a username and a password that's required to access the tool. And if you need to create a login, you can create that clicking on the Create a Login. And if you already have a login and forgot your password, you can click on the I forgot my password and reset it. This isn't a password that OSSE maintains. This is something that you would maintain on your own. And then you fill out the form. So you select the category and fill out the important student information, describe the issue, choose a file if you want to upload it, and then press Save. Now, if you have a global issue, meaning one issue affects multiple students, the same issue, rather than putting in a ticket for every single student, you can actually fill out a global issue template, and you would do that looking at the quick reference guides. There's a template in there for submitting a global issue ticket, and that way you can just submit one ticket for all the students and not have to submit multiple tickets. So once the issue is resolved, if OSSE responds to you that the issue has been resolved, you can ask clarifying information in the description box by clicking on the icon that looks like a pencil. It's the edit icon, and when you're finished, you just click Save. Any questions about if you have data issues or issues with the students identified as LEP, how to get those issues resolved? Okay. So one thing I want to talk about specifically is the OSSE LEP pre-approval status. After the data freezes on October 5th, and prior to when the data are sent to the auditors, OSSE is going to look at all the students who are and are not the full list of students enrolled and bounce that information against our definition of LEP and against our access testing history and make pre-approvals like I mentioned in the process. And that information will be reflected in SLED in the student level data under LEP pre-approval status, what we found when we do that bounce against our other databases. And so the options that you'll see, the permitted values and what you'll see for each student is the student could be identified as LEP, which means they pre-qualify as LEP based on meeting our definition and based on their access for ELL's testing history. So that would be if a student took the access hit for ELLs in the past and earned a qualifying score. The student could also be marked as not LEP, proficient, and that would be in the case where a student scored a 5.0 or above on the access for ELLs and so placed out of that status. The next option is not LEP, age out of range. So this would be if the student was older or younger than is permitted according to the definition of LEP. So if a student is older than 21 or younger than 3 by the LEA's age cutoff date, then that student would not be within the age range and would not be eligible for the LEP funding supplement. And then the last option is pending audit. So if a student is eligible to be sampled and their LEP status, we don't have any access testing history for them and they're within the age range, then they'll get a pending audit pre-approval status. And that means that depending on how the sample audit goes, that student could be approved or denied. If an LEA disagrees with any of the pre-approvals, the time period during which you can request that that be changed is during the appeals window. And the cases in which you would want to submit an appeal would be if the student was denied as LEP based on their access testing history, but say your LEA during the monitoring window reclassified the student as LEP, you would want to submit an appeal and say, I know they scored proficient, but here's my documentation that the student should actually be qualified for the LEP funding supplement because they were reclassified. Any questions about the pre-approval status? Okay. This year we are using the Enrollment Audit QuickBase application for the auditors to transfer the student list of students sampled as LEP to the LEAs, and for the LEAs to upload the supporting documentation. So the way that you will identify the list of students who were sampled and whose documentation you need to submit is by navigating to octo.quickbase.com. You log in with your credentials, just like you do for the OSSE support tool, the OST. Then you click on the Enrollment Audit application icon. And then under that, you click on the LEP Audit roster field, which you can see is circled here, and there will be a file uploaded for you. And you will actually just click on that and it will download the file. Now, when the auditors upload the list of students who were sampled, each LEA ELL coordinator point of contact, according to OSSE's LEA contact list, will receive a notification that the list has been published. So you don't have to keep checking here. You should receive a notification, assuming we have the right contact for your LEA. You should receive a notification that the student list is available for your review. At that point, you have 5 days to review the list and upload the documentation for these students who were sampled. So I think I didn't say it explicitly, but this is a key point that who is listed in the LEA contacts is critical, and you need to make sure that your LEA contact list is completely up to date, because that is going to be who we put into the QuickBase application as the user and who would receive the notification when the audited list is available. Yeah, a question just came in, who should be contacted if you have difficulty logging in? And you can see here, oh, no, it is not actually here, but if you could please contact OSSE.enrollmentaudit@dc.gov. If you are the correct contact for this, for the LEP sample audit and are not receiving the communication. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay. So then where to go to upload the documentation? To upload the documentation, it's in the same exact place in the Enrollment Audit QuickBase application. In the documentation, the way you upload that is you click on the edit icon. You choose the file that you want to upload. And so if you had 3 students whose documentation is being uploaded, I recommend scanning those documents in one file and uploading, though you can upload multiple. You'll only see the last file you upload, but but the other files will be maintained on the back end. So you choose the file you want, and then you press save, which is in the upper right-hand corner. Okay, going through the acceptable documentation. So this is all in the handbook and was shared at the other trainings, but I'll go through it quickly here. That only official scoring sheets will be accepted, documents created by the LEA should not be submitted, and no documents that were retroactively modified should be submitted. All assessments must include the student's first name, last name, date of birth, grade level on the assessment date, and the date on which the student was assessed. Most of the screener score sheets have a space for the student identifier in which you should put USI, but it's not necessarily required. In terms of acceptable documents, for students in grades pre-K 3 to 12, the acceptable documents are listed here in the chart. There's the pre-IPT for students in grades pre-K 3 and pre-K 4. The KWAPT, which is administered to students in grades pre-K 3 through pre-kindergarten through the fall of their first grade year. Then there's the WAPT, which is administered to students in grades 1 through 12, and the model assessment, which can be administered to students in grades K through 12. The column that's second from the right shows what the proficiency cutoffs are, and then the window of time which the assessment will be accepted is in the very last column. If you serve adult LEP students, each adult LEA administers a different assessment that's been approved by OSSE. This is the exact same as the past with the exception of the BEST and BEST Plus, BEST Literacy and BEST Plus assessments. I'm not going to read each of these. I'll just give you 1 second to look it over and see if you have questions. Okay. The document review process. So the auditors, when they receive the documents, they're going to be looking and making sure that the documents are complete, so all required elements are provided, that the documentation represents the student who they listed as being sampled, and that the documents are current, so they were administered within the dates that were allowable. Then they'll compare the grades and make sure that the student took the right assessment for the grade that they're in, and they'll verify that the score is qualifying. I've seen every year cases where LEAs submit screeners for students who've reached the proficiency threshold. And lastly, we're going to go through some non-examples of things that we've seen in the past that I want to just be really clear about, showing you what would be denied so you can avoid this situation. And I'm just seeing a question. I'll pause. Why do we use a different assessment for adult students? I think if I'm understanding the question, it's why can't you use the pre-IPT, KWAPT, WAPT assessment for adult students? And if I'm understanding correctly, these assessments are only designed for students between grades pre-K 3 and 12, and so they wouldn't be appropriate for adult learners. Okay, so jumping into some non-examples, I have on the left here the list of what the auditor will be looking for, and on the right a score sheet from the pre-IPT. So you can see when you look at all the information that was provided, one thing that is missing is the date when the student was assessed. You could see that that is actually blank here. And so this one is going to be denied because the auditor is going to say the documentation was insufficient in this case. Example 2, is there anything missing from the required list of data elements? You can see this is a grades 1 and 2 WAPT scoring sheet. You see the student's name is there. However, most of the other data fields that are required, date of birth, the date when the student was assessed, none of that information was provided. So again, this screener would be denied, even though it looks like the student has a qualifying score. The adjusted overall CPL is a 1.6, which is qualifying, but because none of the other information that's required to verify that this is the right student and that they were assessed at the right time was provided, this would be denied. And then one more example. Is there anything missing from the list of required data elements? We see first name, last name, date of birth, date when the student was assessed. Well, no. However, if you look at the score, the student actually scored a 30, which is above, that's actually a perfect score and above the threshold for consideration as LEP. So this student would be considered orally proficient and not actually qualify for LEP funding. Score is above the proficiency threshold. So one last thing I just want to cover is that these are some edge cases we've seen over the past few years, and I want to make sure we're being clear about them. So if a student was enrolled as of October 5th, but was identified as LEP after October 5th, that student would not be included in the preliminary audit. Schools must submit appeals to have these students counted as LEP during the appeals window in December. Please note that it's the LEA's responsibility to assess and identify the student as LEP within 30 days of the start of the school year or of the student's date of enrollment. If a student was not enrolled as of October 5th, then the student is not eligible for the UPSFF LEP funding supplement. And then the last bullet, it is possible for a student to be reclassified as LEP during the monitoring period after exiting LEP status. If an LEP seeking LEP funding for students who are reclassified as LEP, you must appeal to have those students added to the LEP rosters and submit the following documentation with the appeal. An explanation of the LEA's plan for making determinations to return a student to ESL services and LEP status. This should be signed by the head of LEA, and any supporting documentation in accordance with the plan for these students. So if PARCC ELA scores are used to support that determination to return a student to LEP status, then you would want to submit the student score information.